for your attendance. And anybody who's visiting, we're thankful that you're here. I know people are getting further away from me. The stick can't reach that far. But what we're talking about this month, this quarter, hey, I'm glad you're close. Thank you so much. Well, Sandy won't, so I guess you'll have to. Last week we didn't meet, so 2 weeks ago we talked about this idea of intelligent design. And again, the whole reason for this series this quarter is simply for you to be able to drop a pebble in somebody's shoe. The intent of these lessons are because so many people are now unchurched, and there's been so many generations that have never gone to church. I want you to be able to have an intelligent conversation with them and have a conversation come up on intelligent design or witnesses or maybe geography and topography. And by introducing this subject, you can talk on a scientific basis about these matters. And a lot of these things now point to God. They didn't before, and the reason being is because the scientific community, after about 1859, decided that they were going to leave God out of the mix, and so they approached science from a materialistic viewpoint and through natural process with God outside the picture. So the intent of this is because when I was growing up, to give you my background, my father was an atheist, and he was a rocket scientist, very intelligent person, self-taught pretty much because he was a hydraulics engineer in Germany, is what he studied. And then in the 50s, the Wernher von Braun team from Huntsville were still recruiting scientists and engineers out of Germany to come to the United States on Operation Paperclip. And so my dad, right after he got done with university, he moved they recruited him. He moved to the United States for a specific job, which had to do with hydraulic engineering, which was his major. And when he got here, that job didn't exist anymore. They'd already solved that problem. So they asked my dad, "Do you want to stay?" And he said, "Yeah, I want to stay. I want to, sit." And they said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And so basically, everything at that time with the German rocket team, they didn't go to outside help to solve problems. They basically did it in-house. So if there's a problem, they solved it because there wasn't astrophysics being taught in the colleges at that time. There was not rocket engineering being taught at that time. It was a new science. And so everything they did was based off of new information and just problem solving using the old noggin. And so I always wondered why even though Einstein believed in God and Newton believed in God, my dad didn't. And he basically said it's because we're here. Because we're here, you don't have to argue about it. And I said, well, that doesn't really make sense. That's circular reasoning. Yeah, we're here, but it doesn't tell us why we're here and what's our purpose in life, and doesn't answer those basic questions that a lot of us have. So the intent of this lesson is, even though I never had a real study with my dad, not in a biblical study, but a study outside the idea of a creator, we never got to do that study. And I thought that this topic, I actually got a book called Intelligent Design back 10, 15 years ago, but my dad died shortly thereafter and passed away. And it was a waste. Well, I can't say that I didn't try, but I can say that maybe I didn't have the tools or I didn't have the courage, or I didn't, maybe I felt scared to approach a smart man with this information. So the intent for this lesson is for you to not be scared of science, because science is on your side if you actually look at it. And so that intent of these lessons are simply to give you a subject matter that you can talk to your neighbor about who may not be churched, and get them interested in realizing that science does point to God, which could ultimately, depending upon the kind of life you're leading and the kind of relationship you have with them, may open doors to a Bible study at some point. But the whole purpose is for you to not be ashamed of what's out there. I got this information. Again, I'm just a presenter. I didn't create this information. I didn't do research. I simply went to the internet, and I went to YouTube, and I started just putting stuff in the search bar. Said, how about, is anybody talking about this? Is anybody talking about this? And I found really good material. And one of them is called Creation Talk, and it comes from creation.com, but they have a YouTube channel called Creation Ministries International. And they have guests on that, and they produce shows and videos every week. And and some of them are 15 minutes long, some of them are an hour. And this week that we're looking at was this guy right here. And the reason I like this one was because this guy is a satellite engineer. He builds spacecraft like what my dad was involved in. And so he's obviously he's got a PhD, he's a speaker, and he's one of the people that they've decided to have an interview with. And he came, and this is what he does for a living, is he puts up spacecraft, specifically unmanned spacecraft. And he said, and when he looks at this question, he said there's 4 telltale signs that the universe and life are intentionally designed. And then I threw a bonus in here because at the end of that, he said, well, there's actually 5, so we're going to call it 4 plus 1 or 4 plus a bonus. But there's the 4 things, and we covered the first 2 of these last time we met 2 weeks ago. We covered 1 and 2, and I'll give you a quick review of those here in a minute, and then what we're going to talk about mostly this week is going to be optimal balance and correct components that correctly assembled, and then beauty and diversity. So the 4 telltale signs basically are, number 1 is people see patterns out there in the universe. They see a pattern. If you see a pattern, you see something designed. If you see a car, you know there's a car maker. If you see a beautifully landscaped yard, you know somebody put the effort into it. If you see an aircraft that's heavier than air and it takes off and flies somewhere and you see it in the sky, you said, somebody made that, somebody engineered that, somebody's flying that. And then so all the design out there basically points to the fact that nothing's random. And we looked last time to see that randomness is very improbable. So why are the scientists using randomness and probabilities to say this is where we came from? And it's basically because they define science as how the universe works through observation. And they say if you can't confirm it or deny it by testing and experimenting through experimentation, by touching it, feeling it, seeing it, or measuring it, and then being able to repeat that, then it's not science. But they forget something. The basis of origin and the theories of origin, you can't observe those things. So there's no way you can put a scientific model on where we came from, what the starting point was. So it's not observable outrightly. So, and the other thing we found out last week too is the probability that one protein was ever created out of a soup of non-organic matter. This famous guy from Cambridge who was an astronomer and a leading academic there, he said that the chances of that happening is 1 to the 10/40,000th power, which basically says is if you fill up the whole universe with scientists shoulder to shoulder and blindfold them all and give them a Rubik's Cube, the chance of them having all solving the Rubik's Cubes at the same time is the probability of, by chance, that these things just happened by probability's sake. So most mathematicians now recognize that there's a starting point, and most mathematicians recognize that that this randomness, there's no such thing as randomness because the odds are so far against them. And then the second subject matter that we looked at last time was purposeful information. And to me, this is probably one of the strongest arguments for a creator and for what we have in the Bible and why that's so important. Because what information does is it allows us to think about this. The difference between us and the animals is that we can communicate. And the fact that we have a brain and that I can have an idea in my head and then I can formulate words and say those words and communicate them across to you, and you can hear those words, and then your brain decodes them, and then they have meaning. That's significant because the animals have a limited idea of that, but they can't write books. They don't share ideas. They don't engineer things. At best, they can, growl or snarl or, bark or chirp, but they can't do what we do with information. And the reason being is because information has some very significant levels. First of all, the scientists who look at information, they look at information as being random, and they don't look at it as being coded. And so they look at the first level of information as being statistically, and they look at it as being, I don't know if you grew up being taught this, but some famous atheist said that you could, if you put 100 chimpanzees in a room and give them enough time, they can create the Bible. they can type it all out. And that was a famous quote that I remember learning as a kid and going like, yeah, time solves everything. But statistically speaking, just having characters still doesn't provide you information. So the second level of information is syntax, which means you have to agreed upon code. So you take those letters and you put them in a certain sequence, and then you end up creating words. And so we've agreed upon English here because I'm speaking English and you're hearing English. So that's the language we've agreed upon. That's the code that we're going to be using. So that's the second level. It's called syntax. The third level is called semantics, which basically means I use grammar, hopefully well, but from the South sometimes it's not so well. But you use grammar to convey those words, because if you put the words in the wrong sequence, then you may not learn what the meaning behind those words were. So grammar gives you the meaning once you arrange those words. So not only do you have to arrange the letters into words, then you have to arrange the words in something that makes sense. And that gives you the meaning. And then the fourth level of information is called pragmatics, which basically means once you've received the information from the transceiver, you do something with it. You act on it. So that's the pragmatic. And the fifth level, which is the real level, which is for me the God level, is called apologetics, which means why did the person send it in the first place? And so all those things, we're going to look at some scriptures and get an idea why that's so important. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 11, it says, in the beginning, so there's a starting point, it said God created the heaven and the earth. And then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and so it was. What's significant about the scientists is when we make machines, and this is why artificial intelligence is such a high priority right now for the scientists, is because machines don't duplicate themselves. They can't reproduce. They don't think for themselves. We've seen all the horror movies, about the robot that gets smart and decides it's to rebel and it's going to kill its creator. So we've seen that all in science fiction, but that's really what they're working towards. They want to see whether or not machines can think for themselves and then reproduce. And if we do get to that point, I think God's going to take us home anyway. But the point is God, in the very first chapter of the very first book that he gave us through Moses, he says that I'm going to create something, I'm going to make it, and then within that entity that I make, it's going to have some sort of code in it where it can duplicate itself. And that's what we call life. That's what a living organism is. So that's very significant. The next thing we saw in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, we see something specific here. And remember, what language is simply a code. So if you have an English Version Bible, you've got God's encoded message to you. Think about that. So that's why when I read John chapter 1 and see in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So God basically is saying, I'm code. I'm going to be giving you code. And the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was a light for men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not. And then we see in John 14 and verse 14 of the same chapter and verse 17, who was the Word? We recognize that as Jesus. So not only did God in the beginning made the world, now he's saying he did it through his Word. Now he's saying that the Word became flesh, and that flesh was his only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. So now he's saying that even the encoding that he's given, his Word, Jesus Christ represents that as well, or is that. And then in John chapter 20, it says, many things were written, other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples do, which are not written in this book. These are written that ye might believe in the Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and believing that you might have life through his name. What is significant about that is, notice those 5 levels of information. First is you have the letters. Second, you have the syntax, which means the words. The third is that it has grammar, which means it gives you meaning. The fourth is that it's pragmatic, which means you use it. And all those things are combined right here. It says this stuff was written that you might believe in Christ the Son, and then if you believe, you're going to have life through his name, which shows you the intent that God had, the purpose behind it, which is the fifth level of information. And in Matthew 28, we saw in the Great Commission that basically we're supposed to go into all the world, teach, baptize, teach, and teach, baptize, teach, and then we're supposed to observe. So again, that shows you the pragmatic level. All that information has been encoded for you. God sent it to you. Then you're supposed to act on it. And once you act on it, he's going to be with you always, which shows you the purpose of it in the first place. And that Great Commission was given to all of us. And then 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about preaching the cross. And it says, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring... I forgot to turn my phone to do not disturb because I'm getting little text messages up on the top of my screen, and I'm worried. I don't think it's showing up on yours. So that's a good thing. Technology didn't win that time. So it says, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God, but it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. So again, you see that communicating God's code, that he created the world, he gave his only begotten Son, by you receiving that message and acting upon it, that pleases God there in verse 21. So that was his purpose. So what we're going to talk about this week is optimal balance, which is the third thing. What I mean by optimal balance is basically, go back to that engineer who made that spaceship, that communication satellite. When he made that, he's got to take into consideration a whole bunch of things. What is that satellite going to do? Is it going to be geosynchronous? Is it going to communicate lots of data like a DirecTV satellite where it's going to let you stream? Or is it going to be a military satellite? What's the purpose of that satellite? Then you're going to have to determine how much is it going to weigh. Well, we're not going to weigh unless we know if it's a geosynchronous satellite, and every time it goes around the Earth for 72 minutes, it's outside of the sun and it doesn't get solar energy, so it needs a battery. Well, batteries are heavy. So how much battery do we need? So all these considerations, when that scientist and that engineer creates this craft, he has to take what the mission requirements are, how much it's going to weigh, what is it going to cost to get it into space, is Elon Musk going to send it or not send it, those kind of things. And what's interesting is living organisms already are optimally balanced, and we're going to see that. So living organisms have eyes, and a lot of them do, not everything, but the ones that we're going to be talking about have eyes, and there's 10 fundamental different types of eyes. There's simple eyes, and of those varieties, there's the pit, the lens, the pinhole, and the mirror, and then there's compound varieties. And we won't talk too much about the eye because I've got other things I want to share with you. And then there's the eye, but we'll talk about the functionality of it and the balance that's required. And then it talks about the knees, and I know there's a lot of folks here who've had knee surgery, so you can ignore this part of while it maintains strength, because we know all it does is prove we wear out, which is part of the entropy question. It's part of the question that gives us the idea that Darwinists and evolutionists believe that things are getting more complex and that things are getting better over time, because every time, and everything is a positive. Anytime you have a mutation, it's a positive thing, and when you find a positive thing, it'll select that. But science shows it's the opposite. Science shows everything is deteriorating and going the opposite direction, and mutation is actually bad for an organism, and you can't create new things. It already has to be in the code, the DNA code, which we covered. So what is an optimal balance? Well, there's this concept which is called biomimetics, which is the imitation of biological systems to understand the underlying mechanisms to obtain ideas from nature to benefit science, engineering, and medicine. Basically, this concept here is how scientists thought up until Darwin. the Age of Enlightenment and all the things with Sir Isaac Newton and all those, Leonardo da Vinci and all these folks and the Egyptians, all of them believed that you, through religion and the idea that there was a creator, then you were trying to find out what that creator had for, what the creator designed, and then you were going to figure out that design and see if you can apply it to what you were doing. So this is now a new engineering phenomenon in our country, and I've got some examples here to show you. True science looks at what God creates and says, hey, maybe I can copy that and make a profit, make a product. This guy named Kepler, which I forgot to look at when he was born, but he was one of the original scientists, philosophers, astronomers who realized that Earth wasn't the center of the universe. He said the sun was the center of our solar system, and that we revolved around the sun didn't revolve around us. And so he said that science is a process of thinking God's thoughts after him, which I really think that's a really cool quote, because that's basically what true science is trying to figure out how all this stuff works. And if we can't figure out how it works, at least figure out how to use it. So here I found a neat little website. It says 50 of the world's best biomimicry examples. I didn't get all 50, so I hope you're not disappointed. The first one's the bird. Leonardo da Vinci, back in the late 1400s and early 1500s, looked at birds. Actually, he looked at a lot of things, but if you notice, he had a lot of aircraft that he designed, things that looked like kind of like a helicopter or a gyroscope. He had wings. He would map out the wings of a bird and say, can humans fly? Well, in 1903, guess what? The Wright brothers actually used that design and had the first powered flight. And that was the first one. Now in 1941, you may recognize this. There's a Swiss guy who was out with his dog hunting, and he came back from hunting, and his dog was covered in these burrs. And it's probably happened to you. You go outside and you've got these little prickly things all over your pants or your socks, and you've mowed your yard, and you go like, and you sit there, pick those things off, and they're hard to get off, and they kind of hurt. Well, this guy decided, hey, this is really kind of cool. So he looked at the science of it and said, I'm going to create Velcro. So Velcro came from a plant that stuck on somebody's leg, or a dog, I should say. So that's where Velcro came up. So 1941, so you can describe that, and it's kind of interesting. Now this one was also interesting. In 2006, there's a lily out there that has this really nice spiral flow. And so this water company, and I don't know if you can see it in the top right-hand corner, they designed this spinning mechanism, and you can put this inside water tanks that you're drinking water and spin it, and it cleans the water. It prevents a whole bunch of bad things from happening and makes the water potable, and it's more efficient than anything else they've ever found, and it's all based off of this one lily, which I thought was pretty cool. This one, you may not like this one. Why don't you ever feel them? Most of the time you might hear the buzzing, like when you're sleeping and you hear that little sound, but you never feel them really biting you. You feel afterwards, right? Once they're full of red stuff, then you see them, and then if you smack them, then you got that on your arm, but you don't feel what happens when they bite you, or they're actually not biting you. So what this is, that beak that the mosquito has is basically not just one beak. So they looked at this thing under the microscope, and this proboscis that this mosquito has actually got 3 beaks. And these smart guys, Ramaswamy, and I can't pronounce all their names, but Ramaswamy and Swami Mama, so I guess they're Indian, I think Indian and Japanese. They decided to create a needle that uses the same technology. So they have this needle that has 3 mechanisms in it, just like the mosquito's beak, and one goes in and numbs you a little bit, the other one vibrates so you don't realize something's going on, and then the other one I guess helps pull the blood out. So this needle is designed off the mosquito, and these guys didn't see this till 2008, but how long have mosquitoes been around? I thought this one was really cool too. Shark skin. Well, back in the shark skin, the shark doesn't have scales like other fish. They have these things called dermal denticles. That's hard to say, dermal denticles. And what's unique about those dermal denticles is when they looked at this as a flow thing and saw why sharks could move so fast, is because they're microscopic, by the way, And at the microscopic level, it creates little low pressure areas, and then it allows the flow of the water to cross it much faster. Well, guess what NASA did in Speedo? They decided to make bathing suits out of this stuff based on that design. And back in 2008, 90% of our gold medal winners were wearing these bathing suits. And then they outlawed them. So I want to meet the 2% who won gold, who weren't wearing these bathing suits. I was wondering, they must have been superhuman. They must have been Michael Phelps or something. But isn't that interesting that this again is at the microscopic level. So the other thing was all interesting too is, remember we were talking about all that germs and bacteria and all that stuff and how it's invisible and you need to wash your hands. We had that whole 2 weeks of that stuff. Well, this is interesting. If you use this same technology, hospitals and medical cloths are being made out of this stuff because it doesn't carry bacteria. Bacteria can't grab it, so it won't stay on it. So that was another neat thing that came out of the shark skin. But again, this is 2008. This one to me was the most interesting because the gecko can walk upside down on a ceiling. And it's not because he has suction cups. And it's not because he's got sticky feet. The reason down at the microscopic level, his feet has little tiny hairs called setae. And those little setae hairs at the molecule level, there's a force called van der Waals force. And then again, some scientists figured out van der Waals force. And it's basically, it allows the gecko to not leave some sort of substance behind, and those little tiny hairs to catch that, and there's enough, kind of like magnetism there, that allows them to overcome gravity. And that technology that they found out in 2012, somebody wrote a paper about it, and they said, hey, we need to design this. Well, they've got this sticky stuff now called GecSkin. You can put a ID card's worth of this sticky stuff on something and stick it there and hold 700 pounds. So think of a little match card, a little ID card or whatever, and that's, so you may have seen some of that, and so I thought that was pretty fantastic. And then I think this is maybe the last one. The humpback whale has little knots on his fins. You see those little knots there? They're called tubercles. And some scientists decided, I wonder why that whale has those things there. Are they just deformities, or is there a purpose behind them? Well, they started wind tunneling testing these things and found out not only is it more efficient through the water, it creates more lift, and it also reduces the cost to run those blades. So they're making wind turbines out of it. They're doing a whole bunch of things. Anything that spins through the air, they're using these little bumps, just like they are on the whale's fins. So now we've talked about optimal design. You can see that God's in all these animals and all these things, they're designs for a specific task. If a gecko had evolved, the first time it walked on the ceiling, it would have fallen on its head and died, and it wouldn't have procreated. So, if it had procreated, it wouldn't have the ability to do it. So there's no way a gecko can gradually become, to have that, especially since the gecko doesn't have a microscope to figure out why his feet needed to have these little hairs and not shave them, So this idea, this concept here is called irreducible complexity. And what that basically means is you have the correct components correctly assembled. And going back to that satellite, remember the satellite engineer, he's going to design that machine to do a specific task based on the requirements. So you wouldn't design a satellite that has a bathroom in it or plumbing in it or water system because there's no humans on it, because it's an unmanned craft. So he's not going to add extra things onto that spacecraft because he's got to pay for getting it into space. And so all those things, and so when he designs everything like that, he designs it exactly the way he needs it. Well, living organisms are the same way. They've been designed down to the minutest thing, and they have the correct components doing the right thing at the right time. And DNA is basically that code. And so Darwin says that when you assemble complex things, he says that those things are that the mutations create benefits, and then those benefits are selected. But from science, we know that you can't naturally select something that's not already there. So when they reproduce, they're not going to have that change. And then the best example that they have for this idea of irreducible complexity was a guy named Behe, and he's still around and he's still lecturing, and I watched one of his videos. He's fantastic. He basically said the mousetrap has got like 5 basic components, and if any one of those 5 basic components in the mousetrap, the spring's not there, the hammer's not there, the little lever's not there, and the piece of wood's not there, if any one of those pieces are missing, the mousetrap won't work. So when you look at the human eye from the evolutionist standpoint, you're going to have a skull that's got holes in it, and there's going to have to be some sort of mass there, and then that mass is going to have to, affect light, and then it's going to have to transport that information to the brain through a lens. Then the retina is where it receives that information. Then the optical cord's got to send that part to the brain. But if you're evolving, all those things there are not there at the right time. You may have the holes in the head, but then it doesn't become an eye. So when that thing reproduces, it's not going to create an eye. And science knows that. So that's why the Darwinism is fallacy. And the other thing is, the reason why they can promote Darwinism so well is because people can see changes within an animal species. Like you see different dogs, you see different birds, you see how birds adapt. Some birds change color depending upon the season. Some animals change color depending on the season. They adapt to their environment. That's an adaptation. That's not a change from one species to the next. And the entire fossil record, too, also shows that nothing evolved. It was all just there all at once, all these major forms. There's no intermediary forms. So this next group, Forum of Christian Leaders, there's a really interesting thing. We talked about bacteria a couple of weeks ago and about all the bad stuff. This is a single-celled organism, and it has a tail. And there's something amazing about that single-celled organism that has a tail. You may notice something about it. It looks like it's a motor. And if you look closer, there's the tail, there's the skin membrane in the middle, and then you've got this circular thing. And if you ask Rick, he'll probably describe this to you better than I could, but that little tail on that bacteria can spin 100,000 revolutions per minute. How do they measure that? That's what I would have made. And then not only does it spin 100,000 revolutions per minute, it can reverse course in a quarter turn. So you've got these little tiny bacteria, and they also find their food by measuring gradients inside of whatever fluid they're in to see where their food's at so they can sniff. So they're smelling somehow. They can change by the gradient of what's in this liquid, whatever the liquid is. It can say, oh, that's food. I'm going to go that way. And so it's also measuring stuff. But this little tail, you've got stators and rotors, and the best way to example is, does anybody, I had got a Fisher-Paykel washing machine. And the reason I got Fisher-Paykel is because it didn't have the chain in the motor. It had magnets. So that thing would sit down there, and it basically had this rotary engine in it. It had magnets in the stators, or the stable part, and then inside you got this little thing, and then because the magnets go at different times, it starts to spin. And when it spins, that thing was so fast, it was as fast as a upright machine, the ones that are horizontal. So this was a top-loading washer that spun as fast as the ones that are side-loading. And it didn't have a belt, which means the mechanical failure was a lot lower. And that Fisher-Paykel actually is probably still in the house that I sold over in Knoxville, because the person I was there with, I threw it in so that they wouldn't complain. So that's an interesting motor. But what's fascinating about that is, check this out. There's another one of these little guys that's got 7 of these things, little tails. What I found out when I was in pilot training and I was going through pilot school, when you have a propeller airplane, when you push the throttle up and that propeller starts to spin, what happens is it starts turning the airplane. Now you wouldn't know that, but you end up having to put input with your foot on your rudder to keep it from turning. Because that blade, that propellers that's spinning, if it's spinning clockwise according to you, you're going to have to put left rudder, because the airplane, actually right rudder, to counter the airplane from turning. And the more power you put, the more rudder you have to put in to stop that turning moment. That's why helicopters, if you know it, they don't just have one blade on top. Why is that? Because if a helicopter just has one blade, you've probably seen some of them crash. What happens when they crash? A lot of them, the tail rotor fails, and that thing, the helicopter spins underneath the propellers. You ever seen it? And that's the reason is because that rotational force is acting on that body. So you have to put another propeller on the back side of the helicopter to stop it from moving. Well, guess what this little flagella does? It's got 7 of these tails, 7 of them, and they're spinning at 100,000 RPM, and this thing, it's probably getting dizzy, you know, but no, God created this little bacteria that has counter spinners. And they, through electron microscope and through dyes and whatever, there's the 7 little tails, those little pretty tails over there. But this is the mechanism right here. The 7 tails are the inner gears. There's 24 gears around them going the opposite direction to keep that little bacteria from spinning on its head. So you got seven tails pushing it around, and then you got 24 other little gears that you would have never known. Did that bacteria know I needed 24 little wheels inside there connected? And so the fact that these things are microscopic engines. So basically, that's what it looks like. You've got 7 tails coming out of those big yellow spots, and then you've got all those little green gears inside those tails, connected to those tails going the opposite direction. So basically what this boils down to is upholding all the things in Acts chapter 17. We read, and I'll pull that up real quick and give you an idea. In Acts 17, this is Paul in the midst of Mars Hill talking to all the philosophers in Athens. And he says to them, "You men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For as I passed by, I beheld your devotions. I found an altar to the inscription to the unknown God, whom therefore you ignorantly worship. Him declare I unto you. God made the world and all the things therein, and he is the Lord of heaven and earth, and dwells not in temples made with hands. Neither is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life and breath and all things." And then in verse 28 of Acts chapter 17, it says, "For in him we live, we move, and we have our being. As certain of you or known poets said, for we are also his offspring." So then it says, there's that Kepler quote again, thinking God's thoughts after him. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "Who being in the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power." So all things were in him, was nothing made. And then it says in verse 20 of Romans chapter 1, "For the invisible things of him that were created of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made." So the big picture is this. We didn't get to the beautiful stuff, but I didn't hear a first bell, so that was a second bell. So the beautiful stuff basically means I was going to tell you about the virtuous woman being beautiful and making beautiful things, but in the end it says even though there's beauty in everything that you make, God has created us music, art, and architecture, but all of it pales in comparison. And at the end, he says of the woman who's beautiful, she's going to be feared because she's praised because she fears God, not because she makes pretty things. But it doesn't mean pretty things aren't a good thing. And the other thing is, on the 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 20 through 25, it says, when God is preached, we're born again of incorruptible seed, which is the word of God. It's eternal and lives and abides. The grass and the flower fades, and the word lives eternal. And that's what's being preached to you. So even Peter recognized there's beauty in the creation, but even though the beauty fades, what God has created and what he's preached to you in that information lasts forever. So that's basically this concept of the 5 things here, and we'll just end it. Highly improbable arguments. So patterns are in nature. They're statistically impossible. So it has to be something besides just statistics. There's purposeful information, which everything we have that we learn, languages we learn of God is all through language. Even living beings are all coded information. Optimal balance, everything that's made is made for a certain purpose and it has a lifespan. And everything is made in the right measurements. And then there's beauty in it so that way we can enjoy it. So thank you. Next time.